The emergency lighting inside the corridor of the Starship Obsidian wing flickered in a rhythmic, sickly shade of amber. It was a pulse that mirrored the fading heartbeat of the vessel itself. Princess Vexera pressed her back against the cold, vibrating bulkhead, her chest heaving as she struggled to recalibrate her internal energy. Her skin, usually a radiant tapestry of shifting indigo and crystalline violet, was dimming to a dull, bruised gray. The bioelectric discharge from her fingertips sparked erratically, a sign that her reserves were dangerously low. On the other side of the heavy blast door, the rhythmic thudding of a thermal ram echoed through the metal. Each strike sent a shiver through the ship and a corresponding jolt through Vexera's nerves. They were coming for her, not to rescue but to harvest. To her people, she was no longer a sovereign. She was a failing asset, a piece of ancient technology that needed to be dismantled before the light went out for good. "Stay low, princess," a voice crackled through her comlink. It was rough, grounded, and utterly out of place in the ethereal silence of a Vielve ship. It was the voice of the human. "Elias, they have breached the secondary perimeter," Vexera whispered, her voice like the chime of distant glass. "My resonance is failing. I cannot hold the field much longer." "Just sit tight, Vexera. I'm almost at the junction. The brass back on Earth would have my head if I let anything happen to you, but honestly, I'm more worried about my own hide right now. I've got bogies coming in from the ventilation shafts. It's about to get messy." Vexera closed her eyes, trying to focus on the hum of the ship. She could feel the presence of the attackers through the resonance bridges that linked all Vielve technology. There were 12 of them, elite inquisitors loyal to High Arbiter Valerius. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, their minds linked in a hive mind of fanatical purity. To them, she was a traitor because she had dared to look beyond their dying star. A sudden explosion tore through the blast door. Molten metal sprayed across the floor, and through the thick, ozone-heavy smoke, the silhouettes of the Inquisitors emerged. Their armor was white as bone, etched with glowing runes that hummed with a predatory frequency. "Surrender, princess," the lead Inquisitor intoned, his voice projected through a resonance amplifier. "Return to the source. Let us preserve the purity of the Ethelgard bloodline." Vexera stood, her legs trembling, but her gaze fierce. She reached out, her hands glowing with a desperate flickering light. "You speak of purity while our worlds rot, Valerius. You are not preserving our race. You are building a tomb." The Inquisitor raised a crystalline staff, the air around it warping as it gathered energy for a lethal strike. Before he could release it, the ceiling above him disintegrated. A figure dropped through the hole, silhouetted by the blue fire of jump jets. Elias Thorne didn't move with the fluid elegance of a Vielve warrior. He moved with the brutal efficiency of a man who had spent 10 years surviving the grittiest war zones of the Terran frontier. He landed with a heavy thud, his kinetic rifle already roaring before his boots had even settled on the deck. The sound of human ballistics was a jarring discord in the Vielve ship. High-velocity slugs tore through the Inquisitor's shimmering shields designed to deflect energy, not solid masses of lead and tungsten. Two of the attackers were thrown backward, their white armor shattered. "Time to bug out, princess," Elias shouted, grabbing Vexera's arm with a gloved hand that felt impossibly solid and warm. "Elias, the staff," Vexera warned. The lead Inquisitor recovered, his staff glowing with a blinding white light. Elias didn't hesitate. He reached into a pouch on his tactical vest and pulled out a small metallic sphere. "Eat this, you glow-in-the-dark freaks," he muttered, tossing the sphere toward the Inquisitors. It wasn't a grenade, it was a localized gravity well. The sphere expanded in a fraction of a second, pulling the air, the smoke, and the Inquisitors into a swirling vortex of compressed space. The lead Inquisitor's staff discharged, but the energy was swallowed by the gravity well, twisting harmlessly into the void. Elias hauled Vexera toward the ventilation shaft he had dropped from. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his strength reinforced by the hydraulic servos in his combat suit. As they scrambled upward, the obsidian wing groaned again, a deep metallic scream that signaled the ship's imminent structural failure. "Why did you come back?" Vexera asked as they crawled through the narrow, dark tunnel. "You could have taken the escape pod when the first wave hit." Elias paused for a second. the light from his helmet lamp reflecting off the sweat on his brow. I'm a mercenary, Vexara. We don't leave our contracts behind, especially not when the contract is the only person who hasn't tried to kill me in the last 48 hours. You lie, Elias Thorne, she said, her voice softening. You came back because you gave me your word, Elias grunted, turning back to the task of navigation. Yeah, well, don't go telling people that. It'll ruin my reputation as a cold-hearted grunt. Now let's move. We've got 3 kilometers of ship to cross, a dozen squads of steelheads between us and the shuttle, and about 6 minutes before this whole boat becomes a very expensive firework. As they moved through the darkness, Vexara's mind drifted back to the beginning. Back to the day when the silence of her life had been shattered by the sound of a human's footsteps. 2 months earlier, the Zenith Spire had been a cathedral of light. It was a massive space station carved from the heart of a frozen moon, suspended in the Lumina X system like a diamond caught in the glow of 3 distant suns. Within its halls, the fate of the Ethelgard Dominion was being debated with the cold, detached logic that characterized her people. Vexara had stood upon the ceremonial dais, her body encased in a gown made of woven light and liquid silver. She was the most beautiful thing in the room, and the most terrifying. Her luminescence was so intense that the ambassadors from the neighboring systems had to wear protective lenses just to look in her direction. To the Veil Vey, she was the pinnacle of their biological engineering. To Vexara, she was a prisoner of her own perfection. The High Arbiter, Valerius, had stood beside her, his face a mask of ancient, bark-like skin and glowing blue eyes. He had cleared his throat, the sound resonating through the hall. Dignitaries of the convergence, he had begun. We gather in a time of great shadow. The entropic reach is consuming our outer territories. Our light is being swallowed by the void. To survive, we must strengthen our bonds. Princess Vexara will choose a consort today, a union to seal the alliance that will save us all. One by one, the suitors had stepped forward. The Gilded Prince of Oros had offered a fleet of 500 warships and a dowry of rare isotopes. Vexara had watched him, her eyes reading the resonance of his soul. She saw greed, a hunger for the throne that masked his fear of her power. When he had reached out to touch her hand, Vexara had allowed a small surge of her bioenergy to flare. The prince had collapsed, his nervous system overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of her light. He was carried out on a stretcher, his pride as fractured as his dignity. The High Scholar of the Synaptic Union had offered a mental link, a chance for their consciousnesses to merge and unlock the secrets of the ancient progenitors. Vexara had laughed, a sound like breaking ice. You wish to civilize me, scholar? She had asked. You see me as a wild star to be harnessed by your equations. But you forget that stars burn those who get too close. The scholar had retreated in shame, unable to calculate the variables of her defiance. Silence had fallen over the Zenith Spire. The ambassadors whispered in their various tongues, using words like monster, destroyer, and ice queen. They saw her as an exotic weapon, a dangerous relic of a bygone age. No one wanted the fierce princess. They wanted her throne. They wanted her fleet. But they were all too terrified of the woman herself. I believe we have seen enough, Valerius had whispered to her, his tone dripping with disappointment. It seems the galaxy is not brave enough for you, Vexara. We will have to find another way to secure the alliance. Perhaps a more forceful arrangement. Wait, a voice had called out from the back of the hall. The crowd had parted, and Vexara had felt a strange, jarring resonance. It wasn't the harmonic frequency of her people, or the complex psychic hum of the Synaptic Union. It was something raw, messy, and vibrantly alive. A human had stepped forward. He wasn't tall by Valvey standards, barely reaching 6 feet. His uniform was dark blue, the fabric worn and lacking the ostentation of the royal court. He walked with a casual confidence that bordered on arrogance, his boots clicking against the crystalline floor with a rhythmic thud that seemed to challenge the very foundations of the spire. Elias Thorne had stopped at the edge of the dais. He didn't bow. He didn't offer a fleet of ships or a collection of ancient secrets. He simply looked at Vexara, his eyes a shade of hazel that reminded her of the autumn forests she had only seen in historical archives of Earth. "Who are you, human?" Valerius had demanded, his voice echoing with authority. "This ceremony is for the high houses of the convergence. Elias Thorne, lieutenant commander of the Terran Union Expeditionary Force. He had replied, his voice calm and steady. And I'm not here on behalf of my government. I'm here because I was told no one wanted to take the princess's hand, and back home we don't like to see someone standing alone at their own party. The hall had erupted in laughter. The Erosian delegates hissed, and the scholars chimed with mocking frequencies. A human, a species that had only achieved faster-than-light travel 3 centuries ago. A creature of flesh and bone offering himself to the flame of Athelas. Vexara had descended the steps of the dais, her movement fluid and predatory. She had stopped inches from him, her luminescence flaring in a warning display. The air between them crackled with static electricity, the smell of ozone filling the space. "Do you know what I am, human?" she had whispered, her eyes burning with an inner fire. "I have shattered the minds of princes. I have broken the bones of generals with a single touch. Are you suicidal, or just exceptionally stupid?" Elias had smiled. It wasn't the calculating smile of a politician or the fearful leer of a suitor. It was a genuine, warm smile, one that reached his eyes and stayed there. "Maybe a bit of both," he had admitted. "But I've faced things a lot scarier than a beautiful woman with a bit of a temper. I grew up in the Martian colonies during the Dust Wars. I've seen stars die. You don't scare me, Vexara. You just look like someone who's had to fight too hard for too long." Vexara had blinked, momentarily off balance. In all her cycles, no one had ever spoken to her like that. They spoke to the crown, they spoke to the weapon, but no one spoke to the person. "You don't even know me," she had said, the challenge in her voice softening. "I'd like to," Elias had replied. He had extended his hand, palm up. It was a simple, ancient Terran gesture. An invitation. Just a chance, Vexara. No treaties, no fleets, no political games. Just a chance for you to be more than a legend. The entire hall had held its breath. Valerius had stepped forward, his hand moving toward his ceremonial staff, but Vexara had ignored him. She had looked at the human's hand, a hand scarred by work and war, a hand that didn't glow, didn't hum with power, but felt more real than anything she had ever known. Slowly, as if moving through a dense nebula, Princess Vexara had reached out. Her slender violet fingers had brushed against his skin. The contact had sent a shock through both of them. It wasn't the destructive surge she had used on the Erosian prince. It was a resonance, a sudden, perfect alignment of frequencies that defied every law of Valve science. The light in the hall had flared, then softened to a warm, golden hue. Vexara had closed her hand around his. His grip was firm, sure, and impossibly protective. "The human's proposal is accepted," Vexara had announced, her voice carrying through the hall like a clarion call. "The ceremony is over." The memory of that moment faded as Vexara felt the cold air of the ventilation shaft press against her skin. Elias was still leading the way, his movements tireless. "We're almost at the bay," Elias whispered, his voice snapping her back to the present. "Stay close. When the door opens, I'm going to lay down covering fire. You get to the shuttle and start the engines. Don't wait for me if it gets too hot." "I will not leave you, Elias," Vexara said, her hand finding his in the dark. Elias squeezed her hand, a brief, silent acknowledgement. Then, with a grunt of effort, he kicked open the grate at the end of the shaft. They tumbled out into the hangar bay, but they weren't alone. High Arbiter Valerius was waiting for them, surrounded by a legion of bone-white inquisitors. Beside him stood a figure that made Vexara's heart go cold. It was General Kalen, her most trusted advisor, his resonance blade drawn and glowing with a traitorous red light. "Did you really think it would be that easy, Princess?" Valerius asked, his voice echoing through the vast metallic space. "The human was a useful distraction, but the play is over. It is time for the Ethel Guard to be reborn. And for that, we need your essence. Every last drop of it." Elias stepped in front of Vexara, his kinetic rifle leveled at the High Arbiter. "Sorry, Grandpa," Elias said, his finger tightening on the trigger, "but the lady and I have a dinner date on Earth, and I'm not about to let a bunch of cultists ruin my evening." The hangar bay erupted into chaos. Energy beams crossed with kinetic slugs, and Vexara realized that the battle for her empire was no longer a political game. It was a war for the very soul of her people. And standing beside her, A primitive human was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Elias, Vixara called out as she gathered the last of her energy. Yeah, princess. If we survive this, I really would like that dinner. Elias grinned, ducking behind a shipping crate as a plasma bolt hissed overhead. Well then, let's make sure we don't kick the bucket today. I know a place in Neo-Tokyo that does the best synthetic ramen in the quadrant. It's worth living for. Trust me. Vixara felt a surge of resonance unlike any she had ever experienced. It wasn't pure, it wasn't ancient, and it wasn't Valve. It was something new, something human. She raised her hands, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the flame of Athelis burned with a golden light. The hangar bay of the obsidian wing felt less like a sanctuary and more like an altar for a sacrifice. White-hot plasma bolts hissed through the air, carving jagged, glowing scars into the crystalline floors. Elias Thorne was a blur of tactical movement. His jump jets flared in short, controlled bursts that kept him a moving target. He slid behind a pallet of raw resonance crystals, the heavy rounds of his kinetic rifle thudding into the chest of a lunging inquisitor. Princess, move to the starboard pylon. Elias roared over the cacophony of screeching metal and energy discharges. I can't hold this lane if you're standing in the open like a lighthouse. Vexera didn't move. She couldn't. Her gaze was locked on High Arbiter Valerius, who stood amidst the chaos with a terrifying, serene stillness. The red glow from General Kalen's blade illuminated the Arbiter's face, turning his ancient skin into a map of shadowed valleys. You speak of stars and destiny, Vixara, Valerius said, his voice cutting through the noise not by volume, but by a chilling, unnatural resonance. But you are merely a bird who has forgotten its cage. Do you truly believe your radiance is a gift of nature? Do you think the Valve evolved into these perfect vessels of light by some cosmic accident? We are the children of Lumina X, Vexara shouted, her hands trembling as she forced her internal energy into a defensive sphere. We are the guardians of the resonance. Valerius stepped forward, ignoring the kinetic slugs that whistled past his head. He reached into the air, and a holographic projector hummed to life, casting a massive, flickering image into the center of the hangar. It was a schematic, but not of a ship. It was a biological blueprint, a double helix interwoven with strands of synthetic light and metallic coating. Look at your soul, Vexara, Valerius sneered. Look at the manufacturing stamps etched into your very marrow. Elias paused in his reload, his hazel eyes narrowing as he glanced at the projection. As a soldier, he had seen enough classified medical files to recognize a combat-engineered organism when he saw one, but this was on a scale that defied human comprehension. What is that? Elias asked, his voice low and dangerous. The truth, human, General Kalen growled, stepping beside the Arbiter. We are not a race. We are a legion. 6,000 years ago, the Ethel ancients faced a threat that would have extinguished all life. They didn't pray for a miracle. They built one. They took the raw energy of the stars and poured it into biological husks. They created the Valve to be the ultimate weapon, the Prism Guard. Vixara felt the floor slip beneath her feet, the golden light she had cherished. The luminescence that defined her people's nobility was nothing more than a military specification. The reason our people are dying, Princess, Valerius continued, his tone turning mockingly sympathetic, is because the weapon is degrading. Our purity is actually the failure of our self-repair protocols. We are overclocked. We are burning out because we have no new data to adapt with. We are stagnant water in a gold-plated tank. And the human, Vexara whispered, her light dimming to a ghost of its former self. An anomaly, Valerius spat, a wild, messy collection of random mutations. But in that mess lies the flexibility we lack. We don't want an alliance with Earth for their ships or their credits. We want their chaos. We will harvest their genetic adaptability, weave it into our failing code, and reset the clock on our empire. So you're just a bunch of fancy biobots with a god complex, Elias said, his voice grating with disdain. He stepped out from behind the crystal pallet, his rifle held at the ready. I've seen this show before. The high hats think they can play God, and when the toys start to break, they start looking for spare parts in the gutter. Silence, primate, Kalen roared, lunging forward with his red blade. Elias didn't use his rifle. He dropped it, letting it hang by its tactical sling, and pulled a jagged vibro knife from his thigh holster. It was a brutal piece of Terran steel, vibrating at 10,000 cycles per second. He met Kalen's strike not with grace, but with a bone-jarring parry that sent sparks flying into the general's face. "Listen to me, Vexera," Elias shouted as he wrestled with the Valve warrior. "It doesn't matter where you came from. A weapon is just a tool until someone decides to use it for something else. You aren't a spec sheet. You're the one who chose to stand on that dais and say no to 100 tyrants." Vexera looked at her hands. She saw the opalescent sheen, the mercury-like silver of her skin. She felt the resonance, the song of the ship, and for the first time she heard the clicking of the clock. She was a product, a prototype. But then she looked at Elias. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. He was panting, his muscles straining against a superior foe. He was fragile, temporary, and utterly certain of his own agency. He was a collection of accidents, and yet he was the most purposeful thing she had ever met. "I am not your asset, Valerius," Vexora said, her voice dropping to a frequency that made the hangar walls hum in sympathy. The Arbiter's eyes narrowed. "You have no choice. The protocols are already encoded. You will return to the foundry, or you will flicker out into nothingness." "Then I choose the dark," Vexera declared. She didn't fire a bolt of light. She did something far more radical. She reached into the resonance bridge of the obsidian wing itself and pulled. She didn't seek to control it. She sought to disrupt it. It was like pulling a single vital thread from a tapestry. The hangar lights flatlined. The shields protecting the Inquisitors flickered and died. "Now, Elias!" she screamed. Elias kicked Kalen in the chest, creating just enough space to pull a heavy-duty flashbang from his belt. "Cover your eyes, princess!" The detonation was a white-hot hammer of sound and fury. In the sensory-deprived environment of the Vile Vey, where every being relied on resonance and light, it was the equivalent of a nuclear strike on their souls. The Inquisitors collapsed, clutching their heads as their delicate neural links were shattered by the raw, discordant noise. Elias grabbed Vexara's hand. "Time to bug out. The secondary shuttle is on deck 4. Let's move before the Arbiter gets his bells rung back into place." They sprinted through the darkened corridors, the ship groaning as it began its final descent into the atmosphere of the planet below. Vexera felt hollow, the revelation of her origin a cold weight in her chest. Everything she had known about her history, her divinity, was a lie. "Elias," she panted as they reached the shuttle bay, "if I am a weapon, if I was designed for war, then my feelings, my choices, are they just subroutines?" Elias stopped at the shuttle's hatch, his hand on the manual override. He looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "Princess, I've spent my whole life being told I'm just a cog in the military-industrial complex. I've been conditioned, trained, and pointed at targets like a loaded gun. But every time I pull the trigger, or every time I don't, that's me. Not the brass, not the training, just me." He hammered the override button, and the hatch hissed open. "You're worried about being a weapon? Fine, be a weapon. But you're the one with the finger on the trigger. Now get in the damn seat." As the shuttle roared out of the dying obsidian wing, Vexara watched the great ship break apart in the upper atmosphere. It looked like a falling star, a cascade of crystalline fire. Beside her, the human checked his scanners, his face illuminated by the harsh, green light of the cockpit. They were heading into the Dust Belt, a graveyard of ancient stars and shattered moons. It was a place where light went to die, and for the first time in her life, Vexara found she wasn't afraid of the dark. The Dust Belt was a kaleidoscope of silent destruction. Millions of years of celestial debris, shattered asteroids, frozen gas clouds, and the rusted ribs of long-forgotten derelicts drifted in a slow, gravitational waltz. For a Val Vey, it was a sensory nightmare. The resonance here was jagged, a discordant static that clawed at Vexara's mind like a million tiny needles. "How can you stand it?" Vexara asked, her voice tight with strain. She was strapped into the co-pilot seat of the small utilitarian shuttle, her hands gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned a translucent white. "The noise. It is unbearable." Elias Thorne didn't look up from the pilot's console. His hands moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, flicking switches and adjusting the thruster output to weave through the dense field of debris. "That's just space, Vexara," Elias said, his eyes scanning the long-range sensors. "It's big, it's cold, and it doesn't give a damn about your harmony. To us humans, this is just Tuesday. We call it the grit. You get used to it when you realize the static is just background noise. Focus on the ship. Focus on the heartbeat of the engines." "I am a failure," she whispered, her luminescence pulsing in a slow, mournful rhythm. "A weapon that cannot even handle the static of the void." Elias let out a sharp, dry laugh. "Oh, knock it off with the self-pity. You're not a failure. You're just having a hardware crash. You spent your whole life plugged into a high-speed network of perfect light. Now you're on dial-up. It takes a minute to adjust." He banked the shuttle hard to the left, narrowly missing a jagged shard of silicate. "Besides, being a weapon isn't about how much power you can throw. It's about how much punishment you can take and still keep moving. My old drill sergeant used to say that a shiny gun is just a paperweight. It's the one with the scratches and the mud that actually gets the job done." Vexara closed her eyes, trying to follow his advice. She reached out, not to the wide, terrifying expanse of the belt, but to the small, vibrating frame of the shuttle. She felt the warmth of the life support system, the hum of the fusion core, and the steady, calm resonance of the man sitting next to her. Elias Thorne was an anchor. In the chaos of the revelation, in the sensory storm of the Dust Belt, his presence was a constant. He didn't demand she be a princess or a goddess. He just demanded she stay alive. "Elias," she said after a long silence, "back in the hangar, Valeria said they wanted your genetic chaos, that my people were stagnant. Is that why you came to the Zenith Spire? To offer us a cure?" Elias's hands tightened on the flight stick. "I went to the Spire because the Union told me to go. They wanted intel. They wanted to know if the Valvae were as invincible as the rumors said. I was a spy, Vexara, a high-stakes fly on the wall." Vexara felt a sharp pang of betrayal, her skin flickering into a cold, icy blue. "So it was all a game? The hand, the smile, it was just a tactic?" "At first?" Elias asked, his voice turning quiet. "Maybe. I had a script to follow. But then I saw you. I saw this woman standing in the middle of a room full of people who wanted to use her, looking like she was about to explode from the sheer weight of their expectations. And I thought, damn, she looks just like I did when I was 17, sitting in a foxhole on Mars, wondering if I was anything more than a serial number on a dog tag." He turned his head slightly, his hazel eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. "I didn't take your hand because the Union told me to. I took it because I wanted to see what happened when someone treated the most powerful weapon in the galaxy like a person, and you didn't blow me up. You just held on." A sudden, sharp alarm blared from the console. "Talk to me, computer," Elias barked. "Target lock detected," the automated voice replied, flat and emotionless. 3 pursuit craft approaching from the stern. Signature, Valvae interceptors." "Those guys don't know when to quit," Elias muttered, his jaw setting in a grim line. "They must have tagged us with a resonance marker before we jumped." "We cannot outrun them in this craft," Vexara said, her tactical training overriding her despair. "The interceptors are built for speed. They will reach us within 5 minutes." "I'm not planning on outrunning them," Elias said, his hands flying across the weapons console. "We're in the Dust Belt. Advantage, the guy who grew up playing chicken with asteroid haulers. Vexara, I need you to do something. It's going to be dangerous, and it's going to hurt." "Tell me," she said, her resolve hardening. "I need you to act as a decoy, not with your light, with your static. I need you to dump all your resonance into the shuttle's communication array. Make it look like we're a massive energy signature. Then I'm going to cut the engines and drift into the shadow of that wreckage over there." He pointed toward the skeletal remains of a massive freighter, half buried in a cloud of frozen methane. "If I do that, I will be defenseless," Vexara said. "The feedback from the array will likely knock me unconscious." "I know," Elias said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I'm asking you to trust me, Vexara. Totally. No shields, no light. Just me and a piece of scrap metal." Vexara looked at him. She saw the sweat on his neck, the dirt under his fingernails, and the absolute unshakable sincerity in his eyes. He was asking her to let go of the only thing she had left, her power, and put her life in the hands of a primitive. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the console. "Do it," she said. The process was agonizing. Vixara felt as though her very soul was being unspooled and fed into the shuttle's primitive copper wiring. Her luminescence flared white-hot, then turned into a jagged, screaming violet as she poured her resonance into the array. The shuttle groaned, the electronics smoking as they were overloaded by the sheer intensity of her Veil-Vey energy. "Energy signature peaking," the computer announced. "Decoy signal active." Vexara's world tilted. The screams of the static were deafening, a wall of white noise that obliterated her senses. She felt her grip on the console slip, her body turning limp as the feedback surged through her neural graft. The last thing she felt was Elias's arm catching her, pulling her close to his chest as the shuttle's engines died and the world went black. Vexara woke to the sound of silence. It wasn't the dead, empty silence of the void, but the rhythmic, mechanical hum of a ship at rest. Her head throbbed and her skin felt cold, but the jagged needles of the static were gone. She opened her eyes to find herself wrapped in a thick, woolly blanket that smelled of oil and old coffee. She was lying on a small bunk in the rear of the shuttle. Elias was sitting on a crate nearby, cleaning his rifle with a piece of cloth. "Welcome back to the world of the living," he said, not looking up. "You've been out for about 6 hours." "The interceptors?" Vexara asked, her voice raspy. "They bit," Elias said, a hint of a grin playing on his lips. "They chased your energy ghost right into a methane pocket. One of them got caught in the explosion, and the other two got lost in the debris trying to find us. We drifted for 3 hours with the power off, stealthy as a grave." Vixara sat up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. She looked at her hands. They were dim, the color of a twilight sky, but the internal noise was quieter than it had been in cycles. "You saved me again," she said. "We saved us," Elias corrected, finally looking at her. "I couldn't have pulled that off without your signal." "You did good, Vexara. You held the line." He stood up and offered her a metal cup filled with a steaming, brown liquid. "Here, it's Terran coffee. Tastes like battery acid, but it'll wake up your nervous system." Vixara took a sip, the bitter, hot liquid making her wince. "It is. Intense." "That's humanity for you," Elias said, sitting on the edge of the bunk. "Intense, bitter, and stubborn as hell." He looked at her for a long moment, the silence between them growing heavy with things unsaid. "Vexara, back there, when you chose to dump your resonance." "Why?" "Because you were right," she said, looking down at the cup. "I spent my whole life being a weapon of light, but the light was a prison. It allowed me to see everything, yet feel nothing. In the dark with you, I felt afraid. I felt fragile, but I also felt real." She looked up at him, her indigo eyes searching his. "The Arbiter thinks that by mixing our blood with yours, they will find a new way to conquer. But they are wrong. They do not understand that the power of your people isn't in your ADN. It is in your willingness to be broken and to keep choosing to stand anyway." Elias smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "Maybe, but don't go giving us too much credit. We're also really good at making mistakes." "But you learn from them," Vexara insisted. "My people have forgotten how to learn. We only know how to repeat the protocols of the past. If we are to survive the entropic reach, we need more than purity. We need the grit." A sudden vibration shook the shuttle, more rhythmic than the debris of the dust belt. "That's the docking signature," Elias said, his expression turning sharp. "We've arrived." "Arrived? Where?" Vexara asked. Elias moved to the cockpit and hit a switch, opening the armored shutters of the front viewport. Vexara gasped. Ahead of them, hidden within the hollowed-out core of a massive moon-sized asteroid, was a sprawling, chaotic city of metal and light. It wasn't the symmetrical, crystalline perfection of Zenith's spire. It was a patchwork of salvaged hulls, neon signs, and flickering power conduits. Ships of 100 different designs, human, Veil-Vey, Erosian, and things she didn't recognize, moved in a frantic, disorganized swarm. "Welcome to Nexara Station," Elias said, "the capital of the Riftward territories. It's the biggest scrap heap in the galaxy, full of pirates, refugees, and people who don't want to be found. It's the only place where no one cares if you're a princess or a prototype. He turned the shuttle toward a glowing landing bay, marked with the symbol of the Terran Union, but painted over with a defiant, jagged X. This is where the real work begins, Vexera. We're going to find the people who don't fit the blueprints, the ones the Hi-Hats threw away. Because if we're going to stop Valerius and the Entropic Reach, we're going to need every freak, every failure, and every bit of chaos we can find. Vexera stood beside him, her hand resting on the console. Her light was dim, but her heart was steady. "Let us find them then," she said. "I am ready to see what a weapon can do when it is no longer in its cage." The shuttle glided into the docking bay, leaving the silence of the void behind for the roaring, messy heart of the rebellion. The humanistic theme of diversity begins to take root as Vexara realizes that her perceived perfection was a genetic prison, while Elias's primitive flaws are actually the tools of survival. The path to the lesson has begun, that our differences are not just to be tolerated, but are the very source of our resilience. Nixara Station did not welcome visitors. It tolerated them with the weary patience of a beast that had been kicked too many times. As the shuttle glided through the magnetic containment field of the primary hangar, Vexara felt the transition as a physical blow. The air inside the station was thick, heavy with the sense of recycled oxygen, scorched lubricant, and the acrid tang of too many sentient beings living in too small a space. It was the antithesis of the sterile, perfumed halls of the Zenith Spire. Elias cut the thrusters, the shuttle settling onto the cracked landing pad with a groan of fatigued metal. He didn't immediately move to open the hatch. Instead, he sat there, his hands still resting on the controls, staring out into the dimly lit hangar, where a dozen figures moved with suspicious intent. "Listen to me, Princess," Elias said, his voice dropping into a low, tactical register. "Nexara isn't the Dominion. Out there, your title is worth about as much as a handful of space dust. Most of the folks here are refugees from Valve expansion or survivors of the Entropic Reach. They've got long memories and short tempers. To them, you're just a walking reminder of the people who burn their homes." "I understand, Elias," Vexara replied, though her skin flickered with a nervous, pale violet light. "I am the daughter of their enemy." "It's more than that," Elias said, finally turning to face her. He reached out and adjusted the collar of the heavy, oversized human jacket he had given her to hide her luminescence. "Don't take the bait. If they call you a glow bug or a shiny, ignore it. If they look at you like you're a piece of high-tech garbage, keep walking. I'm the only one here who's got your back, and even my rep is a bit frayed around the edges." He hit the manual release, and the hatch hissed open. The air that rushed in was cold and tasted of ozone. As they stepped onto the pad, the chatter of the hangar died down instantly. All eyes turned toward them. A group of human mechanics, their clothes stained with grease and their arms replaced by rugged utilitarian cybernetics, stopped their work. They didn't look impressed. They looked hungry. "Well, look at what the vacuum dragged in," a woman's voice called out from the shadows of a massive, half-disassembled freighter. A tall, lean woman stepped into the flickering light of the overhead sodium lamps. She had a shock of buzz-cut red hair and a jagged scar that ran from her temple to her chin. A heavy kinetic pistol hung low on her hip, and her eyes, as sharp as shards of flint, were locked on Vexora. "Thorn," the woman said, her voice like sandpaper. "You're 6 weeks late for your tab, and you come back into the hive with a glow bug on your arm? You gone soft in the head, or are you just looking for a quick way to get spaced?" "Stow it, Jax," Elias replied, his voice regaining its easy, confident swagger as he stepped forward to meet her. "I've been a little busy dodging inquisitors and saving the galaxy. You know how it is." Sarah Jax Jackson, the leader of the Nexara Underground, didn't smile. She walked in a slow, predatory circle around Vexara, her eyes scanning the princess's indigo skin and the faint, shimmering patterns of her bioenergy. "She's a Hi-Hat," Jax spat, turning back to Elias. "I can smell the Ethelgard arrogance from here. Do you have any idea how many families in the lower sectors lost everything to her daddy's resource reclamation project? You bringing her here is a death sentence for all of us." "She's not her father, Jax," Elias said, his tone turning serious. And she's got intel on the entropic reach that makes our local sensor data look like a child's drawing. We're all in the crosshairs now. Valerius has turned the Empire into a meat grinder. And we're the meat. Jax looked at Vexera, her lip curling in a sneer. You hear that, Shiny? You're just meat to us. You think that fancy light makes you special? Down here we use glow sticks to light the latrines. Vexara felt the heat rising in her chest, a surge of resonance that threatened to flare through her skin and reveal her true power. She remembered the Zenith Spire, where a single word from her would have sent this woman to the silicate mines. But then she looked at Elias. He was watching her, his eyes pleading for restraint. I have no titles here, Vexera said, her voice steady and quiet. I have only the truth of our common survival. If you wish to kill me for the crimes of my ancestors, do it quickly. But if you wish to stop the void from consuming this station, then let us speak. Jax paused, her hand hovering near her pistol. She looked at Vexara for a long, silent minute, then looked at Elias. Fine, Jax said, spitting on the oily floor. But she stays in the hive's containment sector. If she flares that light without permission, I'll have my gearheads strip her for parts. Move it. They followed Jax through the labyrinthine corridors of Nexara. It was a sensory overload of grit and noise. Vexara saw things she had never imagined existed in the galaxy. Children with dirt-streaked faces playing with rusted drone parts. Traders haggling over recycled water filters. The walls were covered in graffiti, much of it depicting Vaelve warriors as monsters with hollow eyes. They were led into a cavernous room that served as the station's nerve center. It was filled with salvaged consoles, flickering monitors, and a dozen resistance fighters who all looked as if they hadn't slept in a week. Sit rep, Jax barked at a young man hunched over a radar display. The reach is moving, Jax, the man said, his voice trembling. They bypassed the Erosian picket line an hour ago. We're talking 500, maybe 600 capital-class entities. They're not hopping between systems anymore. They're a tide. They'll be at the rift in less than 24 hours. Jax swore, a long string of Terran profanity that Vexara didn't understand, but the intent was clear. 24 hours. We haven't even finished the evacuation of the lower levels, Jax said, slamming her fist against a metal table. We're sitting ducks. We don't have to be, Vexara said, stepping forward toward the main holographic display. The room went silent. The resistance fighters glared at her, but Vexara didn't flinch. She reached out, and for the first time since boarding the shuttle, she let her resonance touch a piece of technology. It wasn't a violent surge. It was a delicate, precise probe. The flickering, low-resolution human holographic map suddenly stabilized. The red blobs representing the entropic reach sharpened into distinct, terrifying shapes. How did she do that? Someone whispered. I'm tapping into the background resonance of the station's structural lattice, Vexera explained, her skin glowing with a soft, focused amber. Your sensors are looking for heat and mass. The reach doesn't have mass in the traditional sense. They are an absence. They are the void given intent. You have to look for the gaps in the light. She adjusted the map, showing a massive, swirling vortex of shadow approaching Nexara. They aren't coming to destroy the station, Vexara said, her eyes widening as she read the data. They are coming for the reactor. Jax frowned. The reactor? It's an old fusion core. Why would they care about that? Because it's not just a fusion core, Elias said, stepping beside Vexara. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. It is a resonance beacon, Vexara said, her voice trembling. My people built this station thousands of years ago as an experimental foundry. The reactor was designed to channel the raw energy of the rift. If the reach consumes it, they won't just destroy Nexara. They will use the energy to tear open a permanent gateway into your space. The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. You're saying we're sitting on a bomb that can end the galaxy, Jax said, her face turning pale. And your people just left it here? We were told it was a failed project, Vexara said, her head bowing in shame. We were told the light had gone out. But Valerius knew. He lured the reach here. He wants them to destroy the riftward territories so he can rebuild the empire from the ashes. You're all the same, Jax spat. Hi-hats, humans, it doesn't matter. You play your games and we're the ones who pay the price. Jax, Elias said, stepping between them. We don't have time for the blame game. If that gateway opens, everyone on this station is KIA before they can even scream. We need to shut down that reactor. Permanently. You can't just turn it off, Vexara said. The core is locked behind a bioresonance seal. Only a Velve of the royal line can interface with it, and even then, the feedback will be immense. Jax looked at Elias, then at Vexara. She saw the fear in the princess's eyes, but she also saw the determination. Fine, Jax said. Thorn, you take the shiny down to the sublevels. My team will provide cover, but once you're in the core, you're on your own. If she tries anything, Elias. I know, Elias said. They moved quickly, descending into the bowels of the station, where the air grew hotter and the smell of ancient, scorched metal became overwhelming. Vexora felt the reactor before she saw it. It was a deep, rhythmic thrum that vibrated in her very marrow. It felt like a voice, 1,000 years old, screaming for release. As they reached the final blast door, a squad of human guards blocked their path. They weren't Jax's people. They were older, scarred men who looked at Vexara with a hatred so pure it was physical. One of them, a man with a missing eye and a prosthetic arm, stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He simply raised a heavy, serrated blade. Move aside, soldier, Elias said, his hand on his rifle. We're on a mission from Jax. Jax can go to hell, the man said, his voice a guttural rasp. This Glowbug's family killed my sons on Velanis Prime. I don't care about the rift. I don't care about the reach. I just want to see her bleed. Elias lowered his rifle, his expression pained. Miller, I was there on Velonis. I lost people too. But killing her won't bring them back. It'll just ensure that everyone else's sons die too. Miller didn't listen. He lunged, the blade whistling through the air toward Vexara's throat. Elias moved to intervene, but Vexara was faster. She didn't use her light to strike. She didn't use her power to destroy. She simply reached out and caught the blade with her bare hand, the serrated metal bit deep into her palm. Instead of red blood, a brilliant, flowing silver liquid began to drip onto the floor. Vexara didn't flinch. She looked Miller in his one good eye, her expression filled with a profound, quiet sorrow. I cannot give you back your sons, Vexara said, her silver blood coating the blade. I cannot erase the fire that my people brought to your world, but I am here now, and I will give my life to ensure that no more fathers have to stand where you are standing. Miller frozen. He looked at the silver blood, then at the princess who was bleeding for him. The hatred in his eyes didn't disappear, but it wavered, replaced by a confused, agonizing grief. He let go of the blade. The weapon clattered to the floor. Vexara didn't pull away. She reached out with her uninjured hand and touched his shoulder. Her skin glowed with a soft, warm amber that felt like a gentle sun on a winter day. For a brief second, Miller's face softened, the lines of tension easing. Let them through, Miller whispered to his men. As the blast doors opened, Elias looked at Vexara, his eyes wide with shock. You didn't have to do that, Vexara. Your hand. It is a small price to pay for a moment of understanding, Elias, she said, her voice weary. My people thought that by being perfect, we would be loved. We never understood that it is in our wounds that we truly find each other. They stepped into the reactor chamber, a cathedral of ancient technology where a massive glowing sphere of pure resonance pulsed with a terrifying, blinding light. The end was near, but for the first time Vexara felt she wasn't just a weapon. She was a bridge. The core chamber was a storm of light and sound. The massive sphere of bioenergy, held in place by 6 crystalline pylons, roared like a trapped sun. The heat was blistering, making the air shimmer and the metal floor vibrate with a frequency that threatened to shake the very bolts from the walls. Elias wiped the sweat from his eyes, his tactical suit already struggling to compensate for the extreme temperatures. All right, princess, you're up. What's the play? Do we just pull the plug? Vexara stood before the console, her luminescence struggling against the overwhelming brilliance of the core. Her injured hand was already beginning to knit together, the silver blood hardening into a shimmering scar. It is not that simple, Elias. This reactor is linked to the station's life support. If I shut it down completely, Nexera will lose pressure and heat in less than 10 minutes. Thousands will die before the evacuation is complete. So we're between a rock and a hard place, Elias muttered, checking his six. He could hear the sound of gunfire echoing from the corridors above. Jax's team was holding the line, but they were running out of time. We need a middle ground. Can you dampen the signal? Hide it from the reach? I can try to phase the resonance, Vexera said, her fingers dancing over the crystalline interface. But to do that, I must merge my own neural frequency with the core. I must become the stabilizer. Wait, Elias said, grabbing her shoulder. You said merge. What's the risk, Vexera? Give it to me straight. No poetic hi-hat talk. Vexera looked at him, her indigo eyes dark with a sudden, sharp clarity. The core is degrading, Elias. Just like my people. Just like me. If I link with it, the feedback will be like trying to hold a star in a glass jar. My neural graft, it might not survive the transition. Elias cursed, kicking a nearby crate. There's always a catch. Why is it always a suicide mission with you people? Because we were designed to be disposable, Elias, she said, her voice a soft whisper that barely carried over the roar of the core. The Ethel ancients didn't build us for longevity. They built us for the moment of impact. I am just fulfilling my function. Elias stepped closer, his face inches from hers. Don't you dare give me that disposable weapon crap again. You're Vexara. You're the woman who gave her blood to a man who wanted to kill her. You're the one who taught me that a gun can choose not to fire. You're not a subroutine, and you're sure as hell not a sacrifice. He grabbed her hands, his rough, scarred skin a jarring contrast to her smooth, opalescent fingers. Listen to me. We do this together. My suit has a neural interface for flight control. If I link with you, I can act as a secondary buffer. I can take some of the heat. No, Vexara cried, trying to pull away. Your human nervous system, it will be incinerated. You have no resonance, Elias. You have no shield. I've got something better than a shield, Elias said, his grin a jagged, defiant thing. I've got a thick skull and the stubbornness of a pack mule. Besides, you said it yourself. My genetic chaos is what your people need. Let's put it to the test. Before she could protest further, Elias pulled a data cable from his wrist link and jammed it into the auxiliary port of the console. He winced as the connection established, his eyes rolling back for a second as the Valve tech began to talk to his human brain. I'm in, he gasped, his voice tight with pain. Initiate the link, Vexara. Now, before I lose my nerve. Vexara looked at him, her heart breaking. She saw the cost of the lesson they were both learning. That true unity wasn't about being the same, but about bearing each other's burdens. She placed her hands on the primary interface and closed her eyes. The resonance bridge is open, she whispered. The world exploded in white. Vexara felt herself being torn apart. Her consciousness was pulled into the core, a swirling vortex of ancient data, broken protocols, and raw, unrefined power. She saw the history of her people, the foundries, the wars, the slow, agonizing decay of a race that had forgotten how to change. She felt the kill switch Valerius had mentioned, a dormant code in her DNA that was vibrating in sympathy with the approaching Reach. The Reach wasn't just an enemy. It was the inevitable end of the Valve. It was the off switch for their light. She was drowning in it, her sense of self flickering like a dying candle. Then she felt a hand. It wasn't a hand made of light. It was heavy, messy, and full of a million different contradictions. It was Elias. His presence in her mind was like a mountain in a hurricane. He was an anchor of pure, unrefined humanity. He brought with him memories of rain on dry earth, the smell of wood smoke, the taste of cheap coffee, and the agonizing, beautiful complexity of a life lived without a blueprint. His chaos acted as a filter. The raw power of the core hit his mind and was broken down into 1,000 different dates and pieces. It couldn't overwhelm him because there was no perfect structure to shatter. He was already a mosaic of flaws, and the energy simply flowed through the gaps. Together, they reached into the heart of the core. They didn't try to shut it down. They began to rewrite it. They wove the human frequency into the Valve resonance, creating a new hybrid signature. The roar of the core shifted. It became a harmony, a complex, shifting melody that Nexara Station had never heard before. The blinding white light softened into a warm, multifaceted spectrum: gold, indigo, green, and silver. Phase, shift, complete, Vexara gasped, her eyes snapping open. She slumped against the console, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Elias fell to his knees beside her, his nose bleeding and his skin pale. But he was alive. Did we do it? He asked, his voice a hoarse rasp. Vexara looked at the monitors. The energy signature of the station had changed. To the sensors of the entropic reach, Nexara would no longer look like a beacon of pure resonance. It would look like a chaotic natural anomaly, a piece of cosmic background noise. The reach is passing, Vexara whispered, watching the red blobs on the map veer away from the station, heading back into the deep void. They have lost the scent. A cheer erupted from the comlink. Jax and her team had heard the news, but the victory was short-lived. Vexara looked at her arm. Underneath the skin, the glowing patterns of her bioenergy were no longer violet. They were shifting, a chaotic, swirling mix of colors that she couldn't control. "Elias," she said, her voice trembling. "The link." It did more than hide the station. Elias looked at his own hands. They were shaking, and for a brief second, his skin shimmered with a faint, ghostly luminescence. "What happened to us?" he asked. "We have crossed the threshold," Vexara said, her gaze turning toward the blast doors. "We are no longer what we were born to be. The synthesis has begun." The blast doors hissed open, but it wasn't Jax who stepped through. It was a squad of bone-white inquisitors, led by a man whose luminescence was so cold it felt like liquid nitrogen. High Arbiter Valerius had arrived on Nexara. "Fascinating," Valerius said, his voice echoing in the quiet chamber. He looked at the hybrid light of the core, then at Vexara and Elias. "I had expected the human to die. I had expected you to break, Vexara, but instead you have provided the very proof I needed." He stepped forward, his crystalline staff humming with a lethal frequency. "The synthesis is possible. The weapon can be upgraded. And now, I have both the blueprint and the catalyst in one room." "Get back, Valerius," Elias growled, struggling to stand, his hand reaching for his sidearm. "You are exhausted, human," the Arbiter sneered, a flick of his wrist sending a wave of kinetic energy that threw Elias against the far wall. "And you, Princess, you are now more valuable than any empire. You are the future of the Ethel Guard, whether you wish to be or not." Vexara stood her ground, her hybrid light flaring in a defiant arc. She realized the cost of the lesson was not just personal sacrifice, but the birth of a new kind of danger. By embracing diversity, they had saved the station, but they had also created the very thing the tyrant wanted. "The synthesis isn't yours to take, Valerius," Vexara said, her voice resonating with the power of the core behind her. "It is a choice, and I choose to fight you." "A choice?" Valerius laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You were built for obedience, Vexara. And I still have the master codes." He raised his staff, and a high-pitched, piercing frequency filled the room. Vexara screamed as the kill switch in her brain finally activated, her own power turning against her. As she fell into the darkness, she saw Elias crawling toward her, his hand outstretched, his hazel eyes filled with a desperate, stubborn hope. The turning point had been reached. The war was no longer about planets or resources. It was a war for the right to be more than a blueprint. The containment field hummed with a predatory, high-pitched frequency that felt like a hot needle vibrating against the base of Elias Thorne's skull. He lay on the cold, obsidian floor of a holding cell deep within the bowels of the Celestial Altar, the High Arbiter's flagship. Every time he tried to move, a jolt of bioelectric energy rippled through his nervous system, leaving the metallic taste of copper in his mouth and a blurred haze in his vision. He was a mess. His tactical suit was shredded, his ribs felt like a bag of broken glass, and his head throbbed with the mother of all neural hangovers. The link with the core back on Nexara had done more than just save the station. It had left a jagged, glowing residue in his mind. When he closed his eyes, he didn't see darkness. He saw the shifting, chaotic spectrum of Vexara's resonance. "Get up, you stubborn ground pounder," Elias hissed to himself, his voice a dry rasp. Vexara is still in the wind, and you're sitting here playing the role of a decorative rug. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. The cell was small, a hexagonal box of reinforced silicate and energy lattices. Across the corridor, he could see other cells, most of them empty, but one held a figure that didn't fit the bone-white perfection of Valerius's inquisitors. It was a Valve, but one who looked like a shattered mirror. His skin was dull, the indigo light replaced by gray, calcified patches. One of his four eyes was clouded over, and his luminescence didn't pulse. It flickered like a dying neon sign. "You are wasting your breath, human," the prisoner said, his voice a hollow, rattling sound. "The High Arbiter does not keep pets for long. Once he has finished mapping the echoes in your brain, you will be recycled into the ship's primary biobattery." Elias leaned against the shimmering energy wall, ignoring the stinging shock it sent through his shoulder. "Nice to meet you too, Sunshine. I'm Elias. And you are?" "I am what happens when the weapon is found wanting," the alien replied, his two remaining eyes fixed on the floor. "I am Cathor. I was once a master of the resonance, a guardian of the seventh gate, but my luminescence drifted 3 degrees into the infrared. A flaw, a corruption. I was deemed unresonant and cast into the foundry to be dismantled." Elias felt a surge of anger that had nothing to do with the energy field. "So that's the grand plan, huh? If you aren't a perfect little light bulb, they throw you in the trash. Your arbiter is a real piece of work, Cathor." "Valerius seeks the origin," Cathor said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He believes that by purging all dissonance, we will regain the power of the Ethel Ancients. He sees your presence as the ultimate dissonance, yet the only key to the evolution he craves." "He's got a funny way of asking for the key," Elias muttered. He looked at the energy field, his hazel eyes narrowing. "Listen, Cathor, I'm not planning on being a battery today. That hybrid energy I tapped into back on Nexera, it's still rattling around in my head. If I can find the right frequency, I might be able to short-circuit this sitch." Cathor looked up, his gray face twisting in what might have been a ghost of a smile. "You truly are as mad as the rumors say. To touch the resonance without a neural graft is suicide. To try and bend it to your will is impossible." "I've been told that since I was 6 years old," Elias said, closing his eyes and focusing on the swirling colors behind his eyelids. He didn't try to fight the chaos this time. He didn't try to structure it. He looked for the gaps, the messy, unresonant spaces between the frequencies. He reached out his hand toward the energy field. His skin began to shimmer, not with the pure violet of the Valve, but with a warm, amber light that pulsed with the rhythm of a human heart. The field screamed as Elias's static touched the purity of the ship's systems. It was a clash of civilizations in miniature. The bone-white silicate of the cell door began to fracture, the resonance unable to handle the unpredictable, jagged data Elias was feeding it. With a sound like shattering crystal, the containment field collapsed. Elias stumbled out into the corridor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his hands, which were still glowing with a faint, flickering amber. He felt like he was falling apart, but he also felt more connected to the world around him than ever before. He moved to Cathor's cell and placed his hand on the console. A second later, the unresonant Valve was free. "Why?" Cathor asked, staring at Elias as if he were a ghost. "I am a broken tool. I have no light to offer." "Because you're a person, Cathor," Elias said, pulling a discarded resonance blade from a fallen inquisitor nearby. "And because I'm going to need someone who knows the layout of this bucket if I'm going to find Vexara. Now can you move, or am I carrying you?" Cathor stood, his gray skin rippling with a sudden, determined spark of light. "I can move, human. If we are to die, let it be in the presence of the flame." They moved through the celestial altar like shadows in a cathedral of ghosts. Cathor led them through the maintenance shafts and the dark, unresonant sectors where the ship's flaws were hidden away. Elias saw the cost of Valerius's pursuit of perfection everywhere. Thousands of Valve who had been deemed imperfect were working in the shadows, their lights suppressed, their voices silenced. "This ship is built on the bones of your own people," Elias whispered, his grip tightening on his weapon. It is the Ethelgard way, Cathor replied. We are taught that the individual is nothing. The resonance is everything. We are mirrors meant only to reflect the light of the throne. Well, I think it's time someone broke the mirrors, Elias said. They reached a junction overlooking the primary hangar. Down below, Elias saw Jax's shuttle, its hull scorched and battered. Beside it, a dozen Nexara rebels were being held at gunpoint. Sarah Jax Jackson was among them, her face bloody but her expression as defiant as ever. Jax! Elias shouted into his comlink, hoping the frequency was still scrambled enough to avoid detection. Do you copy, Thorn? You beautiful idiot. Jax's voice crackled through the static. We got jumped by a heavy cruiser 10 minutes after you were taken. They dragged us here for processing. Where are you? I'm in the ventilation. I've got an inside man and a whole lot of bad ideas. Listen, Jax, when the lights go out, I need your team to bug out. There's an auxiliary bay on Deck 3 with a couple of unarmed transports. Get your people and wait for my signal. The lights going out? Thorn, we're on a ship that is basically made of light. Jax laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. How are you going to pull that off? I'm going to show them what happens when you don't account for the noise in the system, Elias said. He turned to Cathor. Where is the Empyrean bridge? Where would Valerius take her? The bridge is at the apex, Cathor said, pointing toward the towering spire at the center of the ship. But it is protected by the master code. Only those of pure resonance can enter. Then it's a good thing I brought some static, Elias said. As they climbed toward the spire, Elias felt the link with Vexara growing stronger. It wasn't just data anymore. It was an emotional tether. He felt her pain, her exhaustion, but most of all, he felt her fear. Not of death, but of losing herself to the Arbiter's perfection. Hold on, Vexara, he thought, the amber light in his mind burning brighter with every step. I'm coming for you, and I'm bringing the grit with me. They reached the final bulkhead, a massive door of translucent pearl that hummed with the power of 10,000 stars. Two Inquisitors stood guard, their staves already glowing with lethal energy. Leave this to me, Cathor whispered, stepping forward. He didn't use a weapon. He simply opened his arms and let his flickering, infrared light flare. It was a dying gasp of energy, a beautiful, tragic display of a broken soul. The Inquisitors hesitated, their programming struggling to identify the threat. To them, Cathor was a non-entity, a ghost of a failed protocol. That moment of hesitation was all Elias needed. He lunged forward, the vibroblade humming as he took down both guards in a single, fluid motion. He stood before the Empyrean bridge, the door refusing to yield to his touch. It was locked by the master code, the ancient biological key of the royalty. Cathor collapsed, his light almost gone. I cannot open it. Elias, the purity, it rejects me. Elias looked at the door, then at his own hand. He remembered Vexara's silver blood on the floor of Nexara Station. He remembered how her perfection had been shattered by the simple, messy act of empathy. Perfection is a lie, Elias whispered. He didn't try to hack the door. He didn't try to find the code. He reached into his own mind, to the place where Vexara's light and his own chaos had merged. He found the feeling of her hand in his, the taste of the bitter coffee, the fear of the dark, and the stubborn hope of the morning. He poured it all into the door. The Empyrean bridge groaned. The pearlescent surface began to swirl with colors that shouldn't exist. Amber, gray, brown, and violet. The master code was being overwritten by something far more complex. A relationship. The door dissolved. Elias stepped onto the bridge, his rifle raised. High Arbiter Valerius stood at the center of the room, his hands extended toward a massive crystalline pillar. Suspended within that pillar, her body wreathed in white fire and her eyes vacant, was Vexara. She was being unmade, her essence being siphoned into the ship's primary systems to serve as the blueprint for Valerius's new, perfected legion. Welcome, Lieutenant Commander, Valerius said, not even turning around. You are just in time to witness the dawn of a new age. The dissonance is being purged, the weapon is being sharpened. Elias didn't waste words, he fired. The kinetic slugs hit an invisible barrier inches from the Arbiter's back. Valerius turned, his eyes glowing with a cold, blinding light that made Elias stumble. "You still do not understand, human," Valerius said, his voice echoing with the power of the ship itself. "You are a footnote, a dirty temporary smudge on the canvas of history. I am the artist, and Vexara is the masterpiece." "She's not a masterpiece. You old ghost," Elias shouted, fighting to stay on his feet. "She's a person, and she doesn't want to be part of your painting," Valerius laughed. "She has no choice. The protocols are ancient. They are absolute." "Then let's see what happens when the protocols meet the grit," Elias growled. He ran toward the pillar, his amber light flaring as he prepared to do the one thing he was never designed for, to bridge the gap between two dying worlds. The air on the Empyrean Bridge was so thick with energy that it felt like swimming through electrified honey. Every breath Elias took burned his lungs with the scent of ozone and ancient, stale incense. Valerius stood like a monument of cold light, his crystalline staff tapping against the floor, sending ripples of force that knocked Elias back every time he tried to close the distance. "You are persistent, human," Valerius intoned, his voice echoing through the chamber as if the ship itself were speaking. "But you are trying to fight a tsunami with a handful of sand. Vexara is already gone. Her consciousness has been integrated into the hive. She is the resonance now. She is the law." Elias struggled to his knees, his tactical suit hissing as the environmental seals failed. "You're talking too much," he wheezed, blood dripping from his nose onto the pristine white floor. "My old CO always said, the more a guy talks, the more he's trying to convince himself. He hasn't already lost." In the center of the room, the crystalline pillar containing Vexara began to pulse with a violent, jagged light. Her indigo skin was stretched tight over her features, and her luminescence was being drawn out in long, agonizing strands of silver-white fire. She looked less like a princess and more like a ghost being torn between two worlds. "Vexara!" Elias roared, his voice cracking. "Don't listen to him. Don't look at the light. Look at the mess. Look at me." Inside the pillar, Vexara's eyes flickered. For a fraction of a second, the vacant white stare was replaced by a flash of indigo, a spark of terror and recognition. "She cannot hear you, Elias Thorne," Valerius said, stepping toward him. The Arbiter's face was a map of fanatical certainty. "She is the first of the new guard. Through her, we will reach the origin. We will be pure. We will be eternal." "Eternal is just another word for dead," Elias shouted. He reached into his vest and pulled out the last gravity well sphere. "You want purity? You want the void? Have a taste." He triggered the sphere and threw it not at Valerius, but at the base of the crystalline pillar. The explosion of distorted space didn't shatter the crystal, but it warped the energy field surrounding it. The perfect resonance of the siphoning process was suddenly interrupted by a localized gravitational shear. The ship groaned, the lights on the bridge flickering wildly as the power diverted to compensate for the anomaly. Valerius hissed, his serene mask finally slipping. "You dare defile the sanctum!" He raised his staff, and a beam of pure white energy slammed into Elias's chest. Elias was thrown backward, crashing into a console with enough force to shatter the silicate screens. He felt the darkness closing in, his heart fluttering like a trapped bird. The amber light in his mind was fading, being swallowed by the cold, absolute white of the Arbiter's power. In the silence of his fading consciousness, Elias heard a voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the roar of the core or the chime of the resonance. It was a whisper, soft and full of cracks. "Elias." He opened his eyes. Vexara was no longer suspended in the fire. The gravity well had disrupted the siphoning, just enough for her to break the physical connection. She lay on the floor near the base of the pillar, her luminescence almost gone, her skin a dull, bruised gray. Valerius loomed over her, his staff raised for a final, corrective strike. "A flawed tool is worse than no tool at all, Vexara. If you will not be the blueprint, you will be the fuel." "Wait," Vexara whispered, her hand reaching out, not to the Arbiter, but to Elias. Elias forced his broken body to move. He crawled across the floor, his fingers digging into the gaps in the decking. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a plan. He just had the grit. He reached her. His hand found hers, and the contact was like a bolt of lightning hitting a parched field. The amber light didn't just return, it exploded. But it wasn't just his light. It was hers. The silver-white fire of the Violve and the messy, warm amber of the human didn't fight this time. They merged. They flowed into each other, creating a spectrum of colors that the Ethel ancients had never dreamed of. Earth browns, sky blues, forest greens, and blood reds. Valerius stepped back, his eyes widening in genuine horror. What is this? This is corruption. This is entropy. No, Vexera said, her voice growing stronger as she drew on Elias's strength, and he drew on hers. She stood up, her body wreathed in the flickering, multifaceted light of the synthesis. This is life, Valerius. It is messy. It is fragile. It is full of flaws and pain and mistakes. She looked at Elias, and for the first time she saw him not as a companion or a soldier, but as a part of herself. And it is beautiful because of it. You are destroying us, Valerius screamed, his staff discharging a desperate, massive wave of white energy. Vexera didn't raise a shield. She didn't strike back. She simply opened her arms. The white energy hit the hybrid field and was instantly refracted. Like a prism catching a beam of light, the synthesis took the arbiter's perfection and broke it into its component parts. The bridge was filled with 1,000 different voices, 1,000 different memories, 1,000 different ways to be alive. The master code that Valerius relied on, the rigid binary logic of the Ethelgard, couldn't handle the complexity. The ship's systems began to flatline. The bone-white walls cracked, revealing the rusted industrial heart of the celestial altar. The purity, it's gone, Valerius whispered, his own light fading as his neural link to the ship was severed. He collapsed to his knees, his ancient face looking small and frail without the radiance of his office. Vexera stood over him, her hybrid light pulsing with the steady beat of a human heart. The light didn't go out, Valerius. It just stopped being a mirror. We are not weapons anymore. We are a people. She turned to Elias, who was leaning against her, his face a mask of exhaustion and relief. Elias, can you hear them? Hear what, princess? He asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. The ghosts, she said, looking toward the door. Cathor was there, standing at the entrance of the bridge. Behind him were dozens of the unresonant, the gray and flickering Vielve who had been cast aside. They were no longer silent. They were humming, not a perfect harmonic frequency, but a low, vibrating song of defiance. Jax's voice crackled through the comlink. Thorn! Vexara! The whole ship just hit the reset button. The Inquisitors are dropping like flies and the guards are just standing there. What did you do? We changed the channel, Jax, Elias said, a weary grin finally appearing on his face. Tell your team to move. The altar is ours. As the rebels flooded the bridge, disarming the stunned Inquisitors and securing the Arbiter, Vexara and Elias sat on the steps of the dais. The multifaceted light of the synthesis was still there, but it was quiet now, a warm glow that surrounded them both. You really did it, Vexara, Elias said, his head resting against her shoulder. You broke the code. We broke it, Elias, she corrected him. She looked at her hand, which was still clasped in his. The silver scar was gone, replaced by skin that was a deep, vibrant indigo, infused with the warmth of his amber light. I spent my life trying to be the perfect star. I never realized that a star is only beautiful because it burns, and burning means ending. Welcome to being human, princess, Elias said. It's a long, messy road, and there aren't many maps, but the view is usually pretty good. Vexara looked around at the fractured bridge, at the broken arbiter, and at the diverse, chaotic group of humans and aliens who were now working together to save the ship. She realized that the war wasn't over. The entropic reach was still out there, and the Empire was still in shambles. And hung for the first time in 6,000 years, the Vielve had a future that wasn't written in a blueprint. Elias, she said softly. Yeah? That synthetic ramen in Neo-Tokyo. Does it come with extra spice? Elias laughed, the sound echoing through the halls of the celestial altar. Princess, For you, I'll make sure they throw in the whole kitchen." Sure. As they sat together amidst the wreckage of a dying empire, Vixora understood the lesson that Valerius could never learn, that our greatest strength doesn't lie in our ability to be perfect, but in our courage to be vulnerable. In the dark of the void, they had found a light that didn't need a mirror, a light that was fueled by the beautiful, chaotic, and utterly necessary grit of being alive. The transformation had begun. It was painful, it was loud, and it was entirely unpredictable. And as Vexera closed her eyes, she realized she had never felt more radiant. The silence following the collapse of the High Arbiter was not the peaceful quiet of a library, but the heavy, expectant hush that precedes a storm. On the bridge of the celestial altar, the bone-white floors were stained with the gray ash of disintegrated Inquisitor armor and the dark, thick lubricant of shattered Terran drones. Vexara sat on the steps of the command dais, her hands still locked in Elias's grip. Her indigo skin was no longer a uniform, radiant field. It was a map of shifting colors, a living aurora that seemed to breathe with a rhythm that wasn't entirely her own. Beside her, Elias was a mess of soot and dried blood. His tactical suit hissed as the last of its coolant leaked onto the deck, and his breathing was a ragged, mechanical sound. But his hazel eyes were clear, watching the chaotic assembly of humans and Vialve, who were currently attempting to prevent the flagship from falling out of the sky. Jax was barking orders at a group of unresonant Vialve who were hunched over a navigation console. To any traditionalist of the Ethelgard, the sight would have been a blasphemy. A human mercenary, her arms covered in grime and tattoos, was shouting instructions at the former guardians of the resonance. And the Vialve were listening. "I don't care if the subroutines are coded in ancient starlight," Jax yelled, pointing a scarred finger at a flickering screen. "If we don't bypass the primary stabilizer, this whole bird is going to belly flop into the atmosphere in 20 minutes. Use the manual overrides. Grind those crystalline gears if you have to." Cathor, the gray-skinned exile Elias had rescued from the cells, looked up at Jax. His four eyes, once clouded with the despair of the unresonant, were now sharp with a frantic, desperate focus. "The manual protocols haven't been touched in 4,000 years, human. They are calcified." "Then break them!" Elias shouted from the stairs, his voice a hoarse rasp. "That's what humans do best, Cathor. We find the rusty bits and we kick them until they start moving again." Cathor paused, then nodded slowly. He signaled to three other gray-skinned exiles, and together they began to physically tear away the ornamental pearlescent panels covering the console. Beneath the beauty lay the raw, industrial machinery that the Vialve had long forgotten, the grit beneath the gold. Vexera watched them, her mind still humming with the residue of the synthesis. She could feel the ship, not as a perfect harmonic instrument, but as a giant, wounded beast. She felt the fear of the humans, the uncertainty of her own people, and the encroaching cold of the void outside. "They are learning," she whispered, her voice resonating with a depth that made the air around her shimmer. Ilias looked at her, his expression a mix of concern and awe. "Learning what, Vexera?" "To be broken," she said, her eyes following the way a human mechanic was helping an injured Vialve warrior stand. Valerius thought that by removing the flaws he could reach the origin. But the origin isn't a point of perfection, Elias. It is the moment before the first choice was made. It is the raw, messy potential of everything that could go wrong. She reached out and touched a jagged crack in the crystalline dais. "For 6,000 years we were a mirror. We reflected the light of the ancients and called it divinity. But a mirror is empty. It has no depth. It only has what it is shown." "And now?" Elias asked, squeezing her hand. "Now we are the light," she said, "a light that is born from the friction of our differences. It is not as bright, perhaps. It is not as pure, but it is ours." A sudden, deep vibration shook the ship, a sound like the grinding of tectonic plates. The holographic star map in the center of the bridge flared red. "Jax, report!" Elias called out, struggling to his feet. "The entropic reach!" Jax screamed over the roar of a failing power conduit. "They didn't just pass us by. They've turned around. They sensed the pulse we let off when you broke the arbiter. It's like we just rang a dinner bell for the end of the world." Vexera stood, her hybrid luminescence flaring in response to the danger. On the screen, the swirling vortex of shadow was no longer a distant threat. It was a localized collapse of reality, a wall of absolute nothingness that was consuming the very stars in its path. It was only 3,000 kilometers away and closing fast. They are drawn to the synthesis, Vexera realized, her voice growing cold. Our hybrid energy, it is a frequency they have never consumed. To them, we are the ultimate prize. Then we give them a stomach ache, Elias said, his jaw setting in that familiar, stubborn line. What's the plan, Princess? We can't outrun them, and our shields are at 20%. Vexera looked around the bridge. She saw Cathor and his exiles. She saw Jax and her rebels. She saw the broken Arbiter being led away in chains. She saw the diversity of a galaxy that had finally found a reason to stand together. We cannot fight the void with light, Vexara said, her gaze turning toward the primary resonance pillar at the center of the bridge. But we can confuse it with dissonance. Dissonance? Cathor asked, stepping away from his console. But that will destroy the ship's stability. We will lose all cohesion. Exactly, Vexera said. The Reach consumes by aligning its frequency with its target. It finds the harmony and it swallows it. But if we create a field of pure, unpredictable discord, if we broadcast the grit of 1,000 different lives at once, it will have nothing to latch onto. Elias grinned, a bloody, defiant smile. A broadcast of pure chaos. Now that sounds like a human specialty. I need everyone, Vexera said, her luminescence expanding to encompass the entire bridge. I need your memories, your fears, your mistakes. I need the sounds of Earth's rain and Nexara's grease fires. I need the grief of Valve exiles and the stubbornness of human soldiers. I need the orchestra of dissonance. Jax looked at her team, then at the Valve. You heard the lady. Everyone, link up. Grab a cable, touch a console, or just hold on to the person next to you. We're going to be the noisiest thing in this quadrant. The bridge became a web of connection. Humans and Valve joined hands, creating a chain that stretched from the navigation pits to the tactical stations. Elias took his place beside Vexara, his hand resting on the primary interface. Are you ready, Elias Thorne? Vexara asked, her indigo eyes swirling with 1,000 different colors. Princess, I was born ready for a mess like this, he said. Vexara closed her eyes and reached into the heart of the ship. She didn't seek the master code. She didn't seek the harmony. She sought the noise. She opened the resonance bridges of the celestial altar and invited the chaos in. The bridge exploded in a symphony of the impossible. The sounds of human music, distorted electric guitars, rhythmic drums, and the haunting melody of a cello clashed with the crystalline chimes of the Valve. The screens displayed images of 1,000,000 different lives, a sunset over a Martian crater, a crowded market on a forest moon, the birth of a child, the death of a comrade. It was messy. It was loud. It was beautiful. Outside, the entropic Reach slammed into the celestial altar. But instead of consuming the ship, the void faltered. The shadow warped and buckled, unable to find a single frequency to target. The absolute nothingness of the Reach was met with the absolute everythingness of the synthesis. The void screamed, a sound that was heard not in the ears but in the souls of everyone on board. The shadow shattered, its dark tendrils dissolving into harmless wisps of gray smoke as the sheer weight of the ship's dissonance repelled it. The celestial altar groaned, its crystalline structure cracking under the strain, but it held. The void retreated, the massive vortex of shadow collapsing in on itself as it fled from a light it could not understand. As the silence returned, the members of the bridge crew didn't cheer. They simply stood there, still holding hands, breathing in the ozone-heavy air of a ship that had survived the impossible. Cathor looked at his hands, which were still glowing with a faint, warm light. I felt it, he whispered. I felt the rain. I felt the earth. Jax wiped a tear from her eye, though she quickly turned it into a gesture of scratching her nose. Yeah, well, don't get used to it, Shiny. It's mostly just wet and cold. Elias slumped against Vexara, his strength finally spent. We did it, Vexara. We actually did it. Vexara looked at the diverse group of survivors, her heart full of a quiet, profound hope. No, Elias, we didn't just do it. We became it. The first chapter of the end had closed. The void had been repelled, but the galaxy was forever changed. The age of mirrors was over. The age of the grit had begun. The celestial altar hung in the quiet orbit of Ethlis Prime, its bone-white hull now a tapestry of repairs and scars. From the observation deck, the planet below looked like a sapphire set in a bed of velvet, but its radiance was no longer the exclusive, blinding white of the old Dominion. It was a multifaceted glow, reflecting the thousands of ships from Earth, Oros, and the Synaptic Union that now shared its space. Vexara stood at the massive viewport, her hand resting on the cold silicate. She was no longer dressed in the liquid silver gowns of her youth. She wore a simple, functional tunic of velvet silk, reinforced with Terran ballistic fibers. Her skin had settled into a steady, vibrant violet, but the amber sparks of Elias's influence remained, swirling like tiny constellations beneath the surface of her forearms. The war with the entropic reach was not officially over. The void was vast, and there would be more battles, but the tide had turned. The secret of the synthesis had spread like wildfire. Across the territory, species were no longer seeking purity. They were seeking partners. A heavy, familiar footstep sounded behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Elias. He walked with a slight limp now, a permanent reminder of the feedback he had taken on the bridge. But his resonance was stronger than ever. "The council meeting is about to start," Elias said, leaning against the viewport beside her. "The Union brass is arguing with the Vielve elders about trade routes. Jax is threatening to airlock anyone who mentions the word purity again. It's a complete and total mess." Vixara smiled, a genuine warm expression that had become her most common feature. "It sounds perfect, Elias." "Yeah, I guess it does," he said, looking out at the fleet. "Who would have thought? A princess and a grunt, changing the rules of the universe because they couldn't stand to be alone." Vixara turned to him, her indigo eyes searching his. She reached out and touched the scar on his forehead, her fingers glowing with a soft, healing light. "It wasn't just about us, Elias. It was about the realization that we were never meant to be finished products. We were always meant to be works in progress." She stepped away from the window, moving with a grace that was no longer predatory, but inclusive. "Come, we have a world to build." As they walked through the halls of the celestial altar, the transformation was evident in every corridor. Valve architects were working with human engineers to redesign the ship's internal structures, replacing the brittle crystalline lattices with flexible, resilient alloys. In the mess halls, the smell of synthetic ramen mixed with the aromatic vapors of Valve energy nectar. Vexara stopped at the entrance to the Grand Hall, the same place where she had once stood in isolated perfection. Now the hall was a hub of activity. She saw Kathor leading a class of young Valve and human children, teaching them the basics of bioresonance and kinetic physics. She didn't take the throne. Instead, she sat on the steps of the dais, right where Elias had sat during the battle. She watched the people, her people, not by blood or by blueprint, but by choice. She remembered the day in the Zenith Spire when she had first seen him. She remembered the fear she had felt when she realized her perfection was a lie. She thought about Valerius, who had died in his cell, still clutching the dream of a pure, dead past. And she thought about the silver blood she had spilled for a man who hated her. Everything had been a preparation for this moment. Not for a coronation, but for a beginning. "I spent 28 cycles of my life believing that my value was measured by the brilliance of my light. I was taught that every flaw was a failure, every scar a blemish on the legacy of the ancients. I walked through the halls of my palace like a ghost in a museum, terrified that a single discordant thought would shatter the mirror of my existence. But then, a human took my hand. He didn't offer me a perfect reflection. He offered me the grit. He showed me that the most beautiful things in the universe aren't the stars that burn with a steady, lonely fire, but the worlds that are built from the dust of their explosions. He showed me that we are not defined by the blueprints we were born with, but by the ways we choose to break them for the sake of another. I look at my scars now, and I do not see failure. I see stories. I see the silver blood of empathy and the amber light of trust. I realize that the only thing more dangerous than being a weapon is being a weapon that is afraid to be used for something kind. We were created as the prism guard, a shield against the dark. But we found that the dark isn't something to be feared. It is simply the canvas upon which we paint our messy, vibrant, and utterly necessary lives. We are no longer the children of the ancients. We are the architects of the now. And in this great, chaotic symphony of a galaxy, I have finally found my own voice. It is loud, it is discordant, and it is finally, truly, mine. I look at the worlds we are building, the bridges of light and lead, and I cannot help but wonder, why are we so afraid of our own shadows? We spend so much of our short time trying to polish the surface, trying to hide the cracks when it is the cracks that let the light of others in. I think about the people I met on this journey, the humans who fought for a princess they didn't know, the exiles who found hope in a broken song. And I ask myself, and I ask you, in your pursuit of a perfect life, what beautiful, messy parts of yourself have you been trying to erase? What if the very thing you think makes you unresonant is actually the key to the harmony we all so desperately need? Elias stood beside her, offering his hand once more. "Ready to go, Vexara?" he asked. "The ramen is getting cold." Vexara laughed, her luminescence flaring with the colors of 1,000 suns. She took his hand, her fingers interlocked with his, and together they stepped off the dais and into the crowd. The Empress of Ethelgard didn't look back at the throne. She was too busy looking forward, toward the beautiful, uncertain, and perfectly imperfect horizon. Vexara squeezed Elias's hand, her thumb tracing the familiar calluses on his palm.